I grew up in a very involved community. One where everyone knew everyone, and for the most part, the face-to-face contact was usually pleasant. But with such a close-knit community comes people being a little too nosy for their own good. Issues within certain families would arise, and of course the other neighbors would consistently gossip and try to find out information on the situation and run back to the others with their interpretation of what had happened. This continued for a while, until a slew of murders and missing persons plagued the small neighborhood. My parents were very adamant on knowing what I was doing and where I was at all times. They really didn't trust the other neighbors as far as information was concerned, so we mostly kept to ourselves. The only other neighbor we kept in consistent contact with was Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker was a serious older man in his early 80s. He had lost his wife about 6 years prior. He kept mostly to himself, but my parents always wanted to make sure that he was all right. My family and Mr. Walker became close during this time, so much so that I considered him to be more of an uncle. I would go over and help him around the house with various chores he wasn't able to complete. I didn't mind because he would pay me with lunch, butterscotch candy, and stories of when he was in the war. The money was always a plus. As time went by, the neighbors started to move. I assumed mostly out of fear. I honestly never felt any need to be afraid. What I found quite strange was that the ones who spread the gossip were the ones that would end up missing or dead. Mr. Walker would always talk about how people have become so selfish over the years. "They don't even pick up after their own dogs," he exclaimed one day during one of his stories. I can't say I blamed him. Why can't people just be a little more respectful towards one another? The murders and disappearances suddenly stopped. It felt like the only people left in the development were my parents and Mr. Walker. The police would frequently patrol the area, but they never found the culprit. Surely enough, with the pricing of the homes in the area dropping, others quickly swooped in and went for the steal. The new neighbors went from door to door, introducing themselves. My parents were extremely welcoming and pleasant to the new additions to the neighborhood. As people got settled, they started to become more comfortable with each other, and the gossip started up again. One day, as I was walking across the street to Mr. Walker's house, one of the new neighbors flagged me down. I politely walked over and said hello. The woman seemed nice enough. She told me that she met my parents, and how they were very nice people, and she couldn't believe how such a nice area could be so cheap. I smiled and nodded. As the conversation came to a close, she looked directly into my eyes and said, "I know about what happened here, and I think I know who did it." "Really?" I responded. "And who might that be?" Without hesitation, she replied, "That old, creepy man, Mr. Walker. I heard that he killed the parents and kidnapped the children. I heard that he keeps them in the basement." A feeling of anger filled me. How could she talk about an innocent old man like that? Are they really that disappointed with their own miserable lives that they have to bring down someone else? Especially someone they don't even know. I took in a deep breath, and with a quick smirk, I responded, For someone who hasn't lived here long, you sure have a lot to say. Check your source before you go on talking poorly about someone else. Have a nice day." And before she could reply, I walked over to Mr. Walker's house and let myself in. Later on that day, Mr. Walker needed some yard work done in the front yard. He sent me to his shed to get a shovel and a rake. When I was digging through the clutter, I noticed that the bandsaw, shoved in the back corner, had dried splatter marks of a red substance covering part of the machine, and on the floor of the surrounding area. I moved closer to investigate further, when I heard a faint, shuffling noise behind me. I turned slowly to find Mr. Walker standing directly behind me, with a serious look on his face. "I see you found my biggest pride and largest mistake," he muttered, holding his right arm gingerly as he moved towards me. I tried to back up, but I stumbled over something hard that was lying on the ground. I yelped out in pain, and he quickly grabbed me with his left arm. "Take it easy, kid," he exclaimed. When he pulled me to my feet, he rolled up his right arm sleeve, exposing a nasty-looking wound. "I was back here looking for something, and fell over, and cut my arm wide open," he said. I sighed with relief. I apologized for making more of a mess. Then I grabbed the tools and hastily made my way towards the front yard. A few hours had passed, and I was almost done when I spotted one of the new neighbors walking their dog. I waved hello and continued to finish up my work. The neighbor, however, didn't acknowledge me, which I found odd. The people around here are usually always willing to at least be polite. I ignored it and tried to focus on the task at hand. That's when I noticed the neighbor's dog starting to poop on Mr. Walker's yard. Again, not a big deal, until the neighbor decided to pull the dog along and not clean up after his pet. I walked over politely and said hello, but again, he kept walking, ignoring me. I yelled out at him, saying, "Excuse me, can you please pick up after your dog?" The man spun around. His face was beet red. With an irritated tone, he responded, "Or what, kid? What are you gonna do about it?" He spat in my direction and dragged the poor dog along, yelling something that was incoherent. I had enough. First it was the woman who accused poor Mr. Walker of being a murderer, and now this guy. I tightened my grip on the shovel in my hand and swung as hard as I could at the back of his head. I've never lost my temper on someone like this before. The man dropped into a heap. His dog took off down the road and into another neighbor's yard. I stood there frozen, still gripping the shovel. The annoying neighbor from before ran out of her house. "What happened?" she screamed. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring down at the man. "We have to get you inside," she exclaimed. She grabbed my arm and started to move, but not in the direction of her house. We were going towards Mr. Walker's house, who happened to be waiting, holding open the front door. They both helped me inside. Still gripping the shovel, they sat me down in a chair in the living room. "We'll get this all cleaned up in an instant," the woman said with a strange, upbeat tone. I stared at her in horror. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I just killed a man." The woman and Mr. Walker both looked at each other and back at me. But when they stared back, I was met with two eerie grins. "They're going to be so happy that we're going to have a new member of the family," the woman sang out. Mr. Walker nodded in agreement. "Who is going to be happy?" I asked. Mr. Walker pulled the shovel out of my hand and sat down in a chair next to me. Then I heard some movement coming from the back of the house. "Who's back there?" I demanded. "I think they're ready for you," said the strange woman. She grabbed my arm and guided me toward the back room of Mr. Walker's house. When we reached the door, it was shut. The woman rapped on the door 3 times, and it slowly opened. The room was dark. I could barely see anything, except for a single lit candle in the back of the room. "Please, come in," I heard from the darkness. I squinted to get a better view. That's when the woman gave me a little nudge and slammed the door behind me. I heard the click of the lock on the other end. I was trapped. "Have a seat," the voice said. I stumbled through the dark room until I nearly tripped across the only chair and sat myself down. "We are so glad you decided to be a true part of this family," another voice exclaimed. "What's going on?" I demanded. "Who are you people?" A bright light blasted me in the face, and then it was turned onto the faces of the voices in the dark. My parents. "What are you guys doing?" I asked. My dad stepped forward. "We only want what's best for you," he said. "These people, they're just too disrespectful. We need to take care of those who are not willing to be polite and good." My mother chimed in. "You have proven that you are willing to take the necessary steps to better the human race." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own parents. That strange lady. Mr. Walker. They were all in on it. The murders. The disappearances. I didn't mean to hurt him," I stammered. "But he wronged you," my dad said. "You have taken your place as one of the family. Join us."